thank you for joining us. My name is Kara Allen, and I co-lead the Truman National Security Project's Energy and Climate Expert Group. We've all seen the headlines. Wildfires raging in the west, more hurricanes than we have names for spinning out east, glaciers beginning to tear loose in Antarctica, threatening large-scale sea level rise. Scientists' predictions are being realized across the U.S. and the world. Climate change is no longer an issue of the future. It is here now. Today's session will talk about how states and localities are responding, what a new administration could learn from their actions, and how the U.S. can reclaim the mantle of global leadership on the defining challenge of our time. This is a particularly important discussion to me. While I co-lead Truman's Energy and Climate Expert Group, I spend my working days leading implementation of New York State's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, one of the world's most ambitious climate and justice policies. New York is the 13th largest economy in the world. Some of our nation's most landmark movements for change began in New York. Women's rights in Seneca Falls, gay rights at the Stonewall Inn. But New York can't do this alone. No nation or subnationality can. This is one of the many reasons why we need the U.S. to resume its role in the international dialogue and press for stronger global action. It's also why we need voices like Truman to unite us in standing together as one nation guiding the world in addressing this global challenge. Joining us for this critical conversation are the 45th Lieutenant Governor of the state of Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes. He was elected on November 8, 2018. He's the first African American to serve as a Lieutenant Governor in Wisconsin and the second African American to ever hold statewide office. As Lieutenant Governor, Barnes uses a platform of sustainability and equity to fight for solutions that invest in opportunities and fairness for every child, person, and family in Wisconsin, regardless of zip code. He is chair of the state's Climate Change Task Force and one of the most progressive voices in the country when it comes to the urgency with which we must address climate change. It is a personal pleasure for me to introduce our next panelist, Congressman Scott Peters. Congressman Peters represents California's 52nd District, which includes the cities of Coronado, Poway, and most of northern San Diego. First elected in 2012, he currently serves on the House Committee on the Budget and the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where he advocates for investment in basic scientific research, supports the military's goals to enhance their energy security, and fights for common-sense healthcare reforms that work for families and small business owners. He's a member of the New Democrat Coalition and the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition, which I led when he first came to Washington. Our final panelist is the Honorable Sherry Goodman. She is currently a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center and a senior fellow at the Center for Naval Affairs. She is also the senior strategist at the Center for Climate and Security, a former First Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, and a staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Goodman has founded, led, and advised nearly a dozen research organizations on environmental and energy matters, national security, and public policy. She is credited with educating a generation of U.S. military and government officials about the nexus between climate change and national security, using her famous coinage, threat multiplier, to fundamentally reshape the national discourse on the topic. Moderating this esteemed panel is Justin Worland of Time Magazine. Justin covers energy and environmental issues for Time, and he is one of the most impactful reporters in the space today. Again, on behalf of the Truman National Security Project, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here with this really exceptional panel and thrilled that this panel represents so many different parts of the climate conversation today. I'm just going to jump in since we've had that introduction, and I'm going to start with Lieutenant Governor Barnes. Over the last 4 years, as the federal government has really walked back its position on climate, states, subnational actors have really been responsible for sort of filling that void. And so I'm curious, you've been very vocal on this. I'm curious to hear your sense of what comes next. What comes next if there is a new administration that acts differently, and what comes next, if there is another term, another 4 years of the sort of current direction at the national level?
Absolutely. So thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. I think it's important for us to also be clear why the United States is no longer living up to the commitments that we should be making, and that's because of lack of leadership. You can say at the federal level, but that would dismiss the efforts of people like Congressman Scott Peters, who is with us right now. We have a president who doesn't respect climate change, who doesn't accept it as a real thing that is impacting American citizens. So at this point, it is up to the states, the subnationals, to step up and meet commitments. And fortunately, with coalitions like the U.S. Climate Alliance, this is a broad coalition of 25 states, but this 25 states represent 55% of the U.S. population and also over $11 trillion of the U.S. economy. And this is an economy larger than all countries but the US and China. So there is a real opportunity for us to be active and engaged and to create some real progress when it comes to addressing climate change until we get actual leadership in the White House that's ready to take this seriously. So, despite that poor leadership, we have people all across the country who recognize the clear and present danger that climate change presents to our residents, to our communities, and also to our economy. People know that combating this is possible, and people realize that climate action is something that's achievable. But more importantly, people see it as something that's necessary. As was discussed earlier, the wildfires. My state, Wisconsin, people don't look at it as an epicenter of climate change. But I want to remind people that we are sort of a coastal state. We are surrounded by three bodies of fresh water, with Lake Michigan to the east, Lake Superior to the north, and the Mississippi River to the west. So we are absolutely impacted by climate change already. We see warming temperatures in the Great Lakes, which is having an impact on fisheries, and also we're seeing a rising level of Lake Michigan, historic levels every year, year after year, and not to mention these 100-year storms that seem to occur every year here in Wisconsin, which impacts our rural communities. So there's a lot of work to do, and it's not just states either who are doing this work. We're seeing tribal nations stand up, even below the subnational level. You have cities, counties, universities, and business leaders who are stepping up to address climate change because we have to. The reality is right in front of us.
Right. Well, there's a lot of great threads to pull on from that answer. I'm going to go through everyone on the panel, and then hopefully we'll have a more dynamic discussion with everyone jumping in. But I want to come to Congressman Peters next. Let's say that there is a change in leadership at the White House. What needs to happen in the first 2 years of the next presidency and of the next Congress, or rather in the next Congress, for the U.S. to reclaim its position of leadership on this issue?
Well, in the world, yeah. I mean, I think, thanks for the question. Obviously, I think there's obvious answers, like as the Democrats have voted to return to the Paris Agreement, get to the international table to be a player in this, and we should. We're the world's largest economy, and we should be involved in those discussions, both for an offense on climate, but to protect our own interests. We have an opportunity in response to the Chinese effort, the Belt and Road, all of their investment they're making around the world, to reach out and help other countries develop the right kind of energy. Maybe not coal. I mean, there's a lot of cheap coal in India. We should be talking to third world countries about renewables, about cleaner forms of energy, getting them to develop around those kinds of things, and get economic trade benefits out of that as well. We also have to be concerned internationally about deforestation. We should have direct impact on that and making sure that we understand the economics of tearing up those forests and making sure that those communities have some alternative way to live. Those are all opportunities. I have to say, though, to reflect on the Lieutenant Governor's comments, we have to get our own act in order here. The country is tremendously divided right now. And I'm not sure that goes away with the Biden administration, which I fervently root for right off the bat. So I think we fight this war on more than one front. Clearly, we have to be engaged as international players, but we have to get our own house in order. We are not a shining example right now of climate action, given all the rollbacks of various things that the Trump administration has undertaken and the lack of consensus here. I guess finally, and the other panelists may have some thoughts about this too, to be credible on climate, not only do we have to be engaged, not only do we have to be answering the questions here ourselves before we tell other people what to do, we have to be seen as a credible ally. It's not just climate where we've withdrawn from international leadership. It's the trade, the setting the rules of trade. We had a TPP on the table that would have really been a way to push back on China. We've walked away from that. and the Biden administration has been, the Biden campaign has been less than aggressive in how they talk about that in terms of leading the world trade discussions again. We've stepped away from the Iran agreement, and we've stepped away from NATO in many respects. We have a lot of work to do in many different areas to regain the trust and the admiration, frankly, and respect that the rest of the world had for us in general, if we're going to deal with climate. But again, it's very important for us to be engaged, and I think I'd welcome the opportunity to rebuild those relationships and reestablish American leadership, because I think it would be good for us and it would be good for the planet.
Great. Yeah, there's lots of great threads in there as well to pick up on. So finally, I want to come to you, Sherry Goodman, and just to talk a bit about the role of the U.S. military. I think for a lot of people, they don't necessarily think about the U.S. military as when they think about decarbonization and climate leadership, but maybe you could just give us a sense of the role the U.S. military can play in the U.S. regaining its leadership on this issue.
Right. Well, thank you, Justin. And let me thank my fellow panelists, both of whom are spectacular leaders in their own right. And Congressman Peters, you have a lot of military bases in your district, and they're leading the way among those bases that know how to be energy efficient and build climate resilience to maintain the important military missions they carry out. So thank you for your support of them and your community. And I know, Lieutenant Governor Barnes, you are doing comparable leadership at the state level there. And that's really important because, look, our military is the nation's single largest energy user at just under 1% of U.S. energy. It's the largest federal energy user. And it's got important warfighting missions. And we need to have the best trained and fighting force in the world. But we need to do so consistent with recognizing that climate change is a threat multiplier and threatening our forces. It's, we have sea level rise at many of our coastal military bases. We are increasingly deploying our military to fight the natural disasters aggravated by climate change, from wildfires in the West to floods in the Midwest to hurricane and extreme weather in the South. So, Our military is deeply affected by climate change, but it's also learned over the last several decades how to be an environmental and clean energy leader through technology development, by looking for the best renewables and other sources as alternative fuels, by modeling that behavior, leading from the front. We have military leaders across our services who are best in class and sort of leading in their own way by example. And now we have an international group of military leaders. Over 30 countries have joined us in an international military council on climate and security, because many military leaders believe that this is how we reduce risk. This is how we reduce the threats that we face when we're deployed overseas, but also to our forces here at home. And this is how we protect Americans and our nations.
Great. Well, I want to encourage everybody who's participating to ask a question if you'd like. I'm receiving these questions.
Can I follow up on that? Justin, I'd love to follow up on
yeah. Can I? Well,
what Secretary Goodman said.
Sure. Okay.
I just want to tell you the story of when I first met the Commandant of the Marines. I don't know if Sherry, if you've heard this question, but in my first term, I was on the Armed Services Committee. When you're on the Armed Services Committee, the Marines come to your office. And so Commandant, with a bunch of other, literally the brass, the Marine brass, sat down at my table and I thought, what are they going to talk about? Is it going to be, sequester or level of staffing? And the Commandant turns to me and says, Congressman, I said, yes, sir. He says, I want to talk to you about solar energy. Well, why did this Commandant of the Marines want to talk to me about solar energy? Well, what he had determined was that one of the most dangerous things they did was move large amounts of petroleum through the desert from one place to another. And that when those convoys were destroyed, we lost soldiers and Marines. So they'd converted their bunkers to solar panels. And they had solar panels on backpacks to power small appliances that weighed less than the batteries that the troops used to have to carry. And you get stories like that from the Navy too. And the point is that there's a business case for this. It doesn't have to be a partisan thing. Is that the Commandant did not want me to take away his solar panels because they work better than the oil and gas solution that he had. And I think one of the things that we can take from the military is that there is a business case for this to be made. It doesn't have to be partisan. If we could just look at the facts and follow the example of an organization like the military that's respected by Americans of all political persuasions, we can learn a lot. And it's the military who is the leader in renewable energy development in Washington, D.C.
Right. Not only that, I mean, not only in renewables for our forces at the front, but as we're having to operate in a whole new ocean, the Arctic Ocean, which is opening because of climate change, we're also looking at new ways of powering our ships, but also new ways of protecting that vast region.
Right.
Great. Well, so as I was saying before, I was just going to indicate that you can ask questions and I will try to get them to the panelists. I have my own questions as well. And of course, I encourage this great dynamic discussion. So please do just say, talk when you want to talk. But I want to bring in, just on this thread that you're talking about, getting solutions that people can get behind in this highly polarized environment. And I want to bring in Lieutenant Governor Barnes on this, and just to ask, Wisconsin is a state that is has a lot of the issues of partisanship that the country is facing. And I know that you've worked to try to build up from the ground up solutions that everyone can get behind. So maybe you could just tell us a bit about that process, and maybe there's some insight that could be shared across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about the work of our climate change task force, because that's where that is happening. We want to be very intentional about the solutions, or at least proposals, that we brought forth here in Wisconsin. And I have my own opinions. The governor has his own opinions that are pretty much similar to mine, or our opinions are very similar. But at the same time, there's still a wealth of experience out there across the state that goes far beyond what we have, and a wealth of experiences experiences that we should draw from. And that's why when we put together this task force, we brought together people from many different backgrounds, a lot of folks who have been adversarial to each other in the past, without even having conversations with each other. And that was the key point. And we have environmental groups, we have utilities, we have youth representation, we have indigenous communities, we have farming communities, and we have some more conservative farm or agriculture representation, as well as some more progressive leaning as well. But we want to be able to facilitate conversations about the impacts that people were dealing with. And even if we won't agree with utilities all the time, or not a whole lot, the point is they actually made their clean energy goals before the state committed to it, prior to the last administration. That was purely from a fiscal standpoint. But at the same time, you know when you think about energy production, where people have been impacted by that energy production, like with coal burning power plants, for example, it's important for them to be a part of the conversations about why people are upset, why people are frustrated, and why people are demanding change, and why they're questioning why it's taken so long. And through these meetings that we've had, we've also done public hearings, and we couldn't do them virtually. The plan was to travel across the state and have people show up in person, but we did them all online, and that gave us an opportunity to have even more people show up. And before we did the very first one, we were kind of concerned, like, all right, who's going to show up to this, and how's it going to play out? Who's going to say what? There were a million concerns. Those 4 or 5, they all went by pretty smoothly, and we had no less than 100 people show up for each one of those listening sessions, which is very encouraging. And people share stories about their experiences with water, shared their experience about situations dealing with extreme weather events that happen too often. And these are people from all different parts of the state, people in urban areas, people in suburban areas, and people in rural areas. And that was very helpful for us, because we are in the final stages of setting our final list of recommendations that will go to the governor, some which will be included in the state budget, others will be introduced as standalone legislation. And there are also legislators on this task force as well, so that they can hear firsthand what people are talking about. And I feel that was the most effective way to go. And obviously, it led to some very long and challenging conversations, some very long and challenging phone calls. But I feel if we don't have those, we're going to miss the mark or an opportunity to get the most buy-in that we possibly can. And the fact of the matter, I'll just close with, is that people agreed on way more than the average observer would give people credit for. And people accept that climate change is a real thing. People want to do something about it, and even communities that don't use the terms climate change know that something is terribly wrong, and we have to be proactive about it.
Great. Well,
I
I want
really
to.
like your story, Governor, about bringing people together in an inclusive way. We have often found in military communities around the country that the best way to make progress on a range of issues, whether it's how climate impacts are affecting the community or environmental contamination, is to bring together all those stakeholders in an inclusive way. I recall bringing the first set of environmental activists into the Pentagon, many of whom said, "Oh, we've never been here before," or reaching out to different types. And I think that is going to be very important as we try to lead at every level. We have to rebuild the trust that we have lost in recent years, particularly on the international stage, and come back with humility and recognize that the world has changed and we want to be back in the game, but we have to be back in the game recognizing where the world has changed while we've been off stage for the last 4 years.
Right. Very important point. Congressman Peters, is there anything you'd like to add just about the bipartisan nature of some of the proposals and things that you work on? Obviously, looking for consensus has been a focus of your work.
Well, we dealing with climate change is compared to fighting a world war or sending a man to the moon. That's not the kind of thing that a country can do by one party. And right now we face this situation. I think it's really right where Putin's got us right where he wants us, which is we've identified our enemies as each other's. And that's just not going to work. We're not going to be able to manage this big problem with that kind of division. And also, just as a practical matter, I know it's true, probably true in Wisconsin. I can't get anything passed with just Democrats or just Republicans. And if you do pass it, it doesn't last. You see what's happening to the healthcare plan right now. It's been the Republicans' effort to take that out. So we've got to do it together. So I've been spending a lot of time working on figuring out where we can come together. And I would say there's a couple promising things. One is elections. In 2018, it looks like for the first time that not only did climate change poll well, people said, yeah, they approved of taking action on climate change, but they actually took that into consideration when they cast their ballot. So now it makes a difference in who you vote for. And that's gotten the attention of people who before didn't think was that important. You also have, so many of them are Republicans in Florida who see wet streets on sunny days. We know that's climate change. The other thing that's happening is that there's a discussion about this in the evangelical Christian community, which is a really important part of the Republican voter bloc, about creation care. And they don't necessarily want to talk about statistics. They want to talk about what kind of world you're leaving for your children and your grandchildren. And we can have meetings together on climate change where maybe we don't agree on reproductive freedom, or we don't agree on whether two people of the same sex should get married, but we can agree that we have to reduce greenhouse gases. And I think that kind of thing is going to happen here. So I've been looking for where we can start. And obviously, I don't think we're going to start by doing something radical, but we need to build trust with each other and make progress. We only have really effectively 10 years to tackle this as a legislative matter. So we really can't be waiting for the next election each time. We have to start those discussions now, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Right. Well, I'm going to pivot a little bit. I want to talk a bit about some of the international issues, some of the national security issues as well that are raised. And so, Sherry Goodman, I'll start with you. And it's obvious, President Trump denies the science of climate change. And I just wondered if you could just talk a bit about some of the national security issues raised by having, leadership at the federal level that's not engaging on the issue. And looking forward, how might those risks change? Say in the event of a second Trump term.
Well,
Big question.
we're fast. We've already baked in several degrees of warming, and we're fast on the way to even more. And what that means already, look, we just had the second lowest sea ice extent in the Arctic that's ever been recorded, and all 14 of the lowest years have occurred in the last 14 years. So the sea ice in the Arctic, as a vivid example, is rapidly retreating. Permafrost is thawing, and temperatures are rising at such a rate that now, instead of absorbing the sunlight and protecting us further from the ravages of greenhouse gas emissions, it's reflecting it back and provides an additional feedback loop. So now, from a national security perspective, we have a whole new ocean that's opened in our lifetime, and there's increasing potential for competition among both Arctic powers, Russia, US, and others, and even non-Arctic powers like China, which has ambitions to extend its Belt and Road to a polar Silk Road across the Arctic and ply new transit routes from Shanghai to ports in Europe. So this is an example where climate change is changing the security landscape, and now we have to be able to up our game in the Arctic and deploy forces there in ways we didn't have to previously. Or think about parts of Africa and the Middle East that are drying out at an increasingly rapid rate because of climate aggravated drought, which underlay the conflagration in Syria, the prolonged drought which preceded the deadliest conflict of the modern time. And that has meant that farmers and herders who previously lived peaceably together couldn't farm or couldn't tend their flock, fled to the cities, civil unrest, aggravated by political injustice, all led to the greatest migration we've seen in modern times. So much of the migration around the world now is fueled in part by the changing climate. So this has very serious security implications. The solutions are not by and large for the military. The solutions are going to be whole of society ones, where we think about how we enable people to have climate proof their own neighborhoods, their own communities. How do you have more sustainable agriculture, or how do you change your energy mix? And how do you bring water? How do you green the desert that's increasingly occurring, or limit the floods? So those are going to be some of the challenges we face in the future, and we have to come back. That raises a number of questions, not just how we come back into Paris, but how we work with nations around the world to help provide the resources, the support, and work with our allies and partners to address this as a global challenge.
I want to follow up on one point. You mentioned China, and you mentioned working with other countries, and of course, the U.S. has a lot of tension with China over a whole variety of things. Climate not necessarily being a central component of that, but I'm curious whether, what role might China play in climate discussions with the U.S. on security concerns in a future administration? Is this an opportunity for collaboration as it was in the Obama years? I mean, what are your sort of thoughts about the U.S., China, and climate and national security? Throw those all together.
Right. It's a great Truman question. Okay, the Truman audience, really, you should be thinking about this. So look, you can't operate in the Arctic without Russia, right? They're a status quo Arctic power. We have to be able to work with them. Similarly, you can't solve the climate challenge without having the largest greenhouse gas emitter, China, in the game. Now, they are a very serious security, economic, and other challenge to the U.S., have no doubt. And their claims of net zero emissions by 2060, has to be taken in the context of they're still building coal-fired power plants. And, they're still have a very ambitious global quest for resources. So, but at the same time, we'll have to figure out how to continue to work with them on some level of research and development, some level of clean energy research, some level of climate, climate research so that we all can have a better baseline onto which to operate. We have to do it with our eyes wide open. Throughout the Cold War, when Russia was our greatest security threat, we also had elements of communication and cooperation with them on select issues. We're going to have to get back to an era where even with our most strategic competitors, we have the form of dialogue, communication, and exchange that we need for our own national interest.
Great. Yeah, I want to follow. I actually move slightly to Congressman Peters, and I want to ask about. You alluded to the U.S. relations more broadly, and acting as a good partner on the world stage. And I want to ask about the global trade dynamic, which of course is complicated again for reasons that are not due to climate change. But there's a lot of talk about border carbon adjustments, and this is something that's being discussed in the EU, and of course people are talking about it in the US, but that's not a serious, or at least an advanced policy discussion. So how do you see climate and trade intersecting in the next 4 years, and how should the US be responding to this?
Well, I think, I've been an advocate for the United States having its own carbon pricing strategy. I mean, the concern you have if Europe decides to do this is it's in effect a trade war because they will be imposing a tax on us that we won't be in a position to reciprocate. We won't really be on a level playing field if we're not doing something here. So this is one of the areas where there are Republican proposals for a carbon tax and dividend that would not raise any revenue, return all the money back. That's not by elected Republicans, but it's by folks like Hank Paulson and folks who are out of office, Martin Feldman. Obviously, you'd have to do some sort of border adjustment to account for the international effects of that and make sure that it has integrity. But I guess that all that says is that we better get going. We have to come up with what our carbon pricing strategy is going to be, and you can get certainty out of either a cap and trade or a carbon tax. But and I think if you look at the research of Resources for the Future, they'll tell you you can work with either one. But we have to send that price signal to the economy, to every economic actor, and then we have to account for the international effects of it. That's what other countries are doing. I think Canada and California have an agreement talking about social units, but the United States needs to be in that game, and it can't be done just through federal regulation or federal investment. The private sector has to be involved. That's how you send those signals.
What's your sense of awareness and concern on Capitol Hill about the conversation happening elsewhere, but not in the U.S. and perhaps actually affecting U.S. businesses? Are people concerned, aware?
I would say I have 434 colleagues in the House of Representatives. That they are at various levels of interest and understanding about this. I don't think a lot of them are thinking about a border adjustment tax at this point. I think they are thinking about infrastructure. I think if we talk about funding infrastructure, we always talk about a gas tax increase. I think that will lead to a more sophisticated conversation about how to really tax energy to pay for infrastructure. I think that will be some sort of carbon levy. And then I think we'll get to the international adjustment piece of it. So I think that's kind of how it will flow. And I think if we get a President Biden, that discussion at least will start pretty soon. But I would say, if you're asking about level of awareness now, I really think people are trying to fend off this, medically induced coma that the economy is in and deal with the pandemic and probably think about the elections pretty intensively over the next month. By the way, to the Lieutenant Governor, I did have a hotel room in Milwaukee last month, and I was sorry not to be able to make the convention. I know that hurt us both.
Yeah, well, I'm going to turn to you, Lieutenant Governor, next. Just to bring in an audience question and also related to a question I had, thinking about these international conversations, we have someone from the audience who says or asks, what can state and local governments do to engage with their international counterparts to address the climate crisis? I leave it there.
Yeah, I'll say first, I am also disappointed. I have spent some time in your neck of the woods though as well. Got to hang out in Coronado back in 2017, I believe. Really good time. I'm looking forward to going back. But as far as what people can do is still keep up that pressure, and I am counting on a change in administration, turnover in the White House, but we just can't be complacent with an election of a new president. We're still going to have to organize. We're still going to have to make demands of our federal representatives, whether it be Congress or whether it be the House or the U.S. Senate, and also the president himself if Joe Biden is elected. We need to keep pushing because if you look at what his position was going into the primaries versus what it is now after he built that coalition to sort of craft his climate policy, there's a world of difference. There's been tremendous growth. There's still room to grow, but I am encouraged because there is a desire to grow and a desire to want to address the challenges at hand. His most recent speech, not most recent, but a recent speech that he gave on the climate was one of his best. But I think it's important for us, wherever you are, and you can look at it through an international lens, but I prefer to look at it through the local lens because that is where we're going to be the most effective. And looking at it through the local lens, we could potentially have positive international implications. That means laying the foundation. That means centering environmental justice in your conversations. In one thing too that I want to mention about being able to build the group that we built for our task force, it was informative for so many people, including members of the legislature, including some of the ones who've been at the forefront of addressing climate change before I even showed up in the state capitol. And I had a phone call with one of the members, and he's a good friend of mine, and he has always been there on this issue, has never wavered. But he thanked me for the presentation, some of the speakers that we had who brought up environmental justice, who brought up the racial justice component that exists within a climate change frame, because he himself had not considered these things. He himself had not had these issues brought to him. Some of it could be the district that he represents, where he wouldn't have had to be involved in some of those conversations. But it's important to learn that everybody, people are still growing in many regards. And as was mentioned, or as what was mentioned, joining the Paris climate, that's baseline, and we can expect that with a new presidency. But you think about the horrible EPA decisions that have been made, and the investments in green technology that can just happen at the state and local level in green jobs, that can send waves, across international waters, figuratively. But it's important that we do so, and we can connect with our international partners for ideas that they've come up with. I had a chance to go to Madrid last December for COP25, which was an amazing experience because I got to have conversations with some international leaders who were doing some incredible work that, quite frankly, made me jealous. And the question was always, what's the U.S. going to do? And it's like, well, I can't answer for the whole country at this moment. But what I do know is that we are certainly on the wrong track. And when we had an opportunity to become a leader, but states were stepping up in the most necessary way. So for people who are concerned about how do we best solve this problem in an international way, my answer is to do the work locally.
Yeah. Well, can I just follow up with one question, which you alluded to going to Madrid and going to COP, and there are a number of alliances and coalitions of states and subnational actors that are, go to COP and try to represent a different U.S. sentiment on the world stage. What do you think the future, from your perspective, what would you like to see from those sorts of coalitions going forward? Particularly in the event that there might be a federal government that might actually be doing some of the work that you're seeking, the shoes you're seeking to fill. So what should come next for these coalitions?
Well, what should come next is us making bold, decisive action. I mean, we can't waste a minute. And at this point, even with a new administration, we will have wasted 4 years, 4 critical years.
Right.
And so all the commitments that we made, it's going to be important for us to double down on those, because the science suggests that because of the inaction, we have obviously a much shorter window to solve this problem. And so it is important for people who may be working to get a new president to also, apply that same pressure when it comes to on days after January 20th, 2021. I mean, we can't sit here and wait around. We need to have what we thought was enough when the Paris Climate Agreement was signed is wholly inadequate at this moment, and so we have to come up with whatever Paris Climate 2.0 that will be sufficient for us to stave off the worst impacts. And like you said, we're losing more ice in the Arctic than ever before. Historic losses, these historic wildfires, all these things right now that we're witnessing, they're not just going to stop after Election Day. They're not just going to stop after in the event of a new president being inaugurated. We have so much we have so much to reverse, but also I think it's important for us to think proactively. And for so many people who are out of work right now, so many people who are struggling financially, and all the economic woes that the United States is facing, there is only one clear path for us to try to dig ourselves out of it. And there is no recovery that does not include some sort of green recovery. That is a part of a just recovery that significantly benefits not just all Americans, but benefits this globe.
Great. Yeah. Well, I want to pivot slightly. I have an audience question, which I think will maybe help us segue into a conversation a little bit about environmental justice, which Lieutenant Governor Barnes just alluded to. But the question here from the audience is, as people flee to more temperate states within the U.S., how can local, state, federal leaders support relocation? This includes both not only creating incentives for people to stay, this includes not creating or eliminating incentives for people to stay, as well as helping people settle in new places. And then of course the question notes that the poor will hurt the most. Obviously vulnerable people, people of color are particularly vulnerable to some of these threats. I want to start. I know, Congressman Peters, that you've worked on relocation issues, so maybe I'll start with you, and then we can just go across the line. But maybe we'll start with you.
Well, it is true. It's disadvantaged communities that get hit the hardest, and the numbers are staggering. But the thing I always have to remind people is that this is going to be expensive, but it's going to be way more expensive if we don't act up front. So we need to get ahead of this. And one of the things we also have to do is stop digging the hole deeper. So I'm going to be introducing a bill. We have this national flood insurance program that subsidizes people to build their properties back, but they're building them in the same flood areas. And that's got to stop. And that's not necessarily a California issue, but I'm going to have a wildfire issue. I can't continue to be building housing out in the hinterlands anymore. The fires have drawn that line for us. So we're going to have to figure out a way to do more housing where people already live. And we're gonna have to consider affordability and economic justice as part of that whole calculus. But this is not going to be cheap, and we have to provide assistance to people who have to relocate. There's a couple. There's a tribe in Louisiana and a tribe in Alaska that are basically already have to move, and the numbers are all very, very expensive. But we're going to have to get ahead of that, and we can't expect everyone's going to be able to pay for that themselves. We're going to have to help them. Not have to make that same mistake twice.
Right. I mean, are there?
Justin, can I add on?
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
So I want to thank you, both for bringing up and your leadership, Congressman Peters, on this issue of migration, immigration. Look, my parents were Holocaust refugees, and they were among the fortunate few who were able to escape Nazi Germany before it became too late for 6 million. And we see trending that same authoritarian line right now, which is why the most important thing we can all do is vote. But that, on the question of migration, our country's always been enriched by immigrants. And so we need to figure out how to do that again in a just and humane way instead of so lowering our quotas. And part of that is by building back better with good jobs in the clean energy economy,
Right.
of which there are many, everything from capping methane wells to building clean and new infrastructure. And as Congressman Peters noted, we're going to have to think about how we relocate. We've had two villages, one in Louisiana, one in Alaska, that have already been relocated at great federal cost. That won't be the model for every relocation.
Right.
It will have to have incentives from the private sector, real estate, insurance, banking, and others to encourage that better building in other locations that is more climate resilient. And at the same time, we have to sort of account for those environmental justice and equity, racial equity considerations that affect so many communities and are exacerbated by climate change. I mean, 25 years ago, I issued the first and only Department of Defense environmental justice policy. And I was asked recently what I would do to what we should do now, and we need to update it and make it climate relevant and address the many military communities, some of which may have to also, with their civilian counterparts and families, have to relocate because of climate effects as we have to reset the mission. So I think these are all going to be important considerations, and coming up with the local solutions that address local needs is going to be vitally important.
Well, it's a good pivot to ask Lieutenant Governor Barnes about environmental justice and local needs. I mean, I know that's been a focus of the task force. What are the environmental justice issues that you're encountering on the ground in Wisconsin? How are you thinking about addressing them?
Yeah, and I'll say first that poor and low wealth have always been the most impacted since the start. It's not whether they're going to be impacted the most; they've already been feeling it, and we are we are going to experience a mass domestic migration in this country real soon, and states aren't going to be equipped to handle it. They aren't going to be able to handle the outward migration, and other states aren't going to be able to handle the inward migration. So we are going to have a real problem on our hands here. And I'll say for environmental justice, the big reason we are where we are is a lot of people who've been in power for a really long time have continued to put financial gain over people's real lives. And people who have been impacted haven't had a seat at the table or haven't had a voice to air their grievances, because we're talking about people who can't afford to have a lobbyist or don't have the luxury of being a part of some organization that's going to advocate for them. And poor and low wealth people continue to be ignored. That's a story as old as time itself. And so people who've been subject to issues that aren't necessarily related to climate change, but the same factors that contribute to climate change contribute to a lessened quality of life for folks. Like I mentioned before, power plants that are coal burning, spewing toxins in the air, and people develop respiratory illnesses. We look at issues like water contamination, whether if you're in an urban area, it be lead. If you're in a rural area, it could be phosphorus contamination, nitrates, runoff from these large factory farming operations that have been wreaking havoc on communities, coming in, destroying the local economies because they get to run roughshod of the law. They get to, skirt environmental law, and it is causing tremendous harm on watersheds and waterways in our rural communities. So environmental justice, a lot of times people think that it's like, that is an urban issue, and it couldn't be more wrong, right? It's the same way when people think about social justice or criminal justice reform, they think about the issues that are related to unfair sentencing for drug possession, and they think of it as a central city issue. Well, we got a lot of drug issues out in rural Wisconsin and rural America as well, and it's about how we respond to those crises. And is it going to be incarceration, or is it going to be figuring out a way to provide treatment for these folks? So we should look at it, environmental justice, within that same lens, and making sure that people who have been impacted, mostly Black and brown or low wealth communities, can be a part of any large scale movement, and actually taking their perspectives and their experiences into account. And that's why we wanted to have that to be such an important critical part of our task force work, because somebody living on the coast and having to move is one thing. It's a problem. It sucks. It shouldn't have to happen. But a person who's trapped and confined in an area where they don't have access to resources at all, let alone the ability to just up and move somewhere, that means people are going to be stuck in some very dire situations. So that's what environmental justice is. That's what it means. But it also gives us the impetus to solve this problem, because there are going to be a whole lot of people without the luxury of being able to get away from climate change.
Right. Actually, and just by the way, just to add, I agree with everything that Lieutenant Governor said. But in the big picture, remember that those communities that are most affected today by climate change are those communities that will be most helped if we act on climate change. So the urgency for action and for mitigation, as well as for adaptation, is also part of dealing with environmental justice.
Yeah. Well, I want to lead. Is there anyone else who wants to say anything else about environmental justice? I mean, maybe actually to hear Sherry Goodman, if you maybe talk a bit about. I was surprised to learn 25 years ago about this DoD environmental justice initiative, and so I'm curious, how did that unfold? How is it? Was it a success?
Well, the directive, is still in place. There was a mandate, 25 years ago under the Clinton administration to address environmental justice across the country and across federal agencies. So we created the first DoD environmental justice policy. At the time, we recognized that pollution for contaminants, let's say, from military activities in certain communities, particularly low-income communities around military bases, was a problem, and that we needed to pay special attention to it. And these were in places like depots, like in San Antonio. I even provided clean water to communities around a Massachusetts military reservation when their water became contaminated from plumes of chlorinated solvents. Now we need to address, there are new contaminants we know about today, some called PFAS, PFOA, that I'm sure the Lieutenant Governor has heard of in Wisconsin. It's not only military activities, but it has been used by the military, and that's widespread water contamination. So we need to address that. That affects the more vulnerable communities more acutely, and we need to account for the climate, impacts. There, for example, Norfolk military base. Norfolk is the largest concentration out beyond San Diego. Congressman Peters, of our military facilities, and it has regular sunny day flooding. It has, and sometimes people can't get from home to work on the base because of sunny day flooding. And so we're going to have to address that. And there are historic communities that are divided somewhat by race in an area that was part of the South and that, hasn't addressed, some of that historic incongruities, and that's aggravated now by these climate impacts. And so we need to reach out. I think, both governments, but also in some cases, the military has a responsibility because it's part of the community and the families live there. And I think this is something that, with the right dedication, the right leadership at the federal, state, and local and military level, that we can do. But it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge, but I think we can do it if we reach out in an open way and are open to finding those good climate-proof solutions and looking for the jobs in the new energy economy.
If I could just quickly add, like the PFAS contamination is definitely not just military; it's everywhere. The PFAS contamination, non-coating on pans, firefighting foam. PFAS that's the problem, that it exists everywhere. And getting rid of it is a mystery right now.
Right,
mystery
but
to
if
be
we
solved.
declared it, if we made it a hazardous substance, if EPA declared it a hazardous substance, you'd have some more tools at your disposal in terms of the research
Yep,
and development and the regulation of it. That's what we need to do under the
absolutely.
Safe Drinking Water Act.
Right. Great. Well, I want to ask audience questions. We have about 9 minutes left, and I want to make sure I get to these remaining audience questions. So for Sherry Goodman, the question is, as extreme weather batters the country, do you see potential for a new coalition of National Guard leaders, federal base commanders, and governors and members of Congress of both parties to formulate high-level recommendations to Congress? So interesting question.
Well, as Congressman Peters talked about, there already is a lot of bipartisan work going on energy and climate legislation. And over the last several years on the defense bills, there have been tens of amendments directing the Department of Defense better to evaluate the threat assessments of climate impacts, to build more resilient bases, to install newer energy technologies, to further develop its research capabilities on climate tech, to better understand the changing Arctic. So there are many, many provisions, and they've all been conducted in a bipartisan way. So I think the seeds of action are there. The questioner also asked about the National Guard. The National Guard has been taking some very interesting steps to address this. There's a National Guard Arctic Interest Group, for example, and that includes the Guard leaders from not just Alaska, but sort of all across the Great Plains. I believe Wisconsin is a member of it, Maine. And you don't even have to be a close Arctic state, but if your Guard is interested in learning how to operate in cold weather capabilities, and developing interest. So I've seen a lot of leadership on these issues coming out of the Guard. I think we might see something similar on flooding, on response to wildfires. And I do think what we need to do is unleash the leadership in the Department of Defense that's sort of just below the surface right now at the action officer level. There are groups working on resource competition, environmental security, and stability to understand threats to our combatant commands around the world. There are environmental and energy technology programs, but we need to put that research to action. And I think that's really the next step. And the Truman community, you all out there, the next generation leaders, are going to be a great part of it. And I'm looking forward to being able to work with you in the future.
Well, that's so interesting. It's funny not funny. It's interesting to imagine the unleashing of all of that potential and everything that's happening just below the surface. Would be interesting to see what that might look like. Well, this is an interesting question that I think that comes up a lot in a lot of different contexts. But I'm really interested to ask this panel, which is, how can we talk to our family members who deny climate change and change their minds? And I think this is such an interesting panel because you all have different perspectives in different communities that you talk to. Some of you have to talk to lots of different communities, and so anyway, I'm curious to hear your perspective, particularly with respect to your district, state, the military, et cetera. So we can just go across, beginning with Congressman Peters and then go across the panel here.
Well, you have to meet people where they live. I have to confess that I have my parents are extremely liberal and anti-Trump. We don't have the difficult Thanksgiving conversations that a lot of folks do in my family. But I do think you have to talk about what's important to them. So for some folks, it's that they have their kid has asthma and they're suffering from pollution that coincides with climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. For some folks, they've dealt with, they see these storms, they see the fires. They know that something's wrong. Some folks you can talk to with data, but usually those folks are already convinced. I think you have to meet them where they are. And I would say the other thing is, to the extent that there's uncertainty, it's a little bit like buying fire insurance for your house. I mean, we just want to do the prudent thing, and we want to be ready. I guess, and the other argument I often make is that if you end up with spending money, getting cleaner air, an easier way to get around than your single-family automobile, and more walkable communities, that's okay. If you're not worried about climate change, those are still good byproducts of this kind of action. But I wish there was a magic bullet, but I think that it's a multi-layered conversation.
Yeah. Sherry Goodman, if you can go next.
Well, I think I agree with Congressman Peters. You have to meet people where they are. And sometimes the arguments have been, well, if we address climate or environmental protection, it will cost us jobs or our economy won't be so strong. But now we've seen that that's actually a very false dichotomy. That, in fact, we're growing more jobs in the clean energy sector, and that when our air is cleaner, our water is cleaner, and we reduce climate risks, that we have more prosperity. And that's where, that frontier, we've been talking clean tech in California. Now people are starting to talk climate tech, improve predictive capability. That's a whole frontier where we can be leading and creating jobs. In the military, I mean, they're really very. I did years ago, but I don't really encounter climate deniers in the military anymore because you all, like in the Truman community, you guys get it. You understand, you live it, you see it. So the question is, how are you going to do it? And how are you going to reduce the risk to the military mission? You're going to have to operate in higher temperatures. That's going to put more heat stress on our forces when they deploy with all that gear in 120 plus degree heat. So, that's where telling that story, personal story of the increasing Black Flag days that our military is experiencing because of heat in the Southwest or deployments overseas, or the effect on even military aircraft or and civilian aircraft of changing air density because of higher temperatures. When you want to take off, you need more fuel. So that just, has an additional double climate impact. Those kinds of stories, and also the impact where you live, military families directly impacted by sea level rise and wildfire and air pollution for communities. Those are, I think, what really matters.
Lieutenant Governor Barnes, Wisconsin's a diverse state, lots of different communities. How do you communicate on this?
A whole lot of different communities, and I think I'll use a confluence of what the previous two panelists mentioned. One being the fact that people that may not use the words climate change realize that something not great is going on. Again, I can go back to a lot of rural communities that I've had a chance to visit on these storm damage tours that we do. And one was a big tornado event that we had, another was, or there have been multiple flooding events, and people just understand that something is not right in their communities. And the other part of it too is where the economy is going, where jobs are being created. The renewable energy sector is ripe for it. Green jobs is the way out of this economic mess, and it's the way out of this climate disaster that we find ourselves in. So for people who are thinking about how to rebuild economically and also have some opportunity and benefit for themselves, right now, our family farms are struggling in the state of Wisconsin, but if we introduce other opportunities for them to add wind or solar projects to their already existing agriculture operations, this can provide tremendous opportunity for families that don't know if they are going to be able to continue the traditions that their families have been a part of since they moved to Wisconsin. And so I think for people that don't get it, don't want to talk about it, a lot of times there can be selfish individuals that need to know how they will be benefited from the conversation. So we talk about how we can help to improve their quality of life, provide more opportunities for them and their surrounding communities. And I'm right on the dot.
Yeah.
Well, that is perfect note to end on. I think a great discussion. We talked about everything from bipartisan solutions, to talking to your family members about climate, to the international security issues that are raised. Happy to kick it back, but thank you so much to these panelists. Really great discussion.